They jumped out of the hoverpod and ran down the alley at the side of the factory. Immediately they could hear the other two hoverpods thudding down behind them. "Mr. Krantz!" cried Will when they reached the corner of the building. "Can you stay here and try to delay them, even for a minute?" "I'll try, Will," said the old man, and he picked up a piece of wood from the ruin of the building next door and gripped it with determination. He turned back to stand his ground as Will, Davina and Stanley disappeared around the corner. Will ran for the entrance to the factory. His plan depended on being able to find all the children together. He dashed through the doorway with Stanley and Davina close on his heels. They raced down the stairs and burst into the foodarium. And there were the children, just as he has hoped, all lined up on either side of their tables, hungrily hunched over their soup. The two supervisors looked up, startled, but before they were even on their feet, Will had raced past them into the room. He leapt onto one of the tables, kicking bowls and spilling soup. "Followers!" he cried. The children looked up. "Followers! I am your leader!" "He is your leader! He is your leader!" shouted Davina and Stanley, prancing around the tables. "Look! See! He is your leader!" The children stared. The supervisors stopped in their tracks now, halfway from their chairs, and glanced at each other in confusion. Perhaps this was some new test that Professor Gelmet had devised. Only this afternoon they had been instructed by the professor to get out and allow these same three children to investigate the factory. Will pointed at the motto that was written on the wall under the windows. "Obedience knows no obstacle," he cried. "Obedience knows no obstacle," murmured the kids, as if they had repeated it often before. "Who do you obey?" demanded Will. He found Myron's face in the crowd. "Myron Dort, who do you obey?" "The leader," said Myron. "Who is your leader?" Myron stared at him blankly. I am your leader. Followers, stand." The children stared at him. "Stand! Stand!" cried Davina and Stanley. "Followers, stand!" The children began to stand. "Stand!" Now they were all on their feet. Will glanced at the doorway. He could see Professor Gelmet and Dr. Fugg coming down the stairs. "Follow me!" he cried, and he began to run along the table toward the other end of the room. "Follow him! Follow him!" shouted Davina and Stanley, running along the table beside him. Will leapt down from the table and ran for the kitchen. As Professor Gelmet came into the foodarium at one end, Will, Stanley and Davina ran out the other end, pursued by the children who were following him blindly. The crowd of kids poured through the kitchen and streamed up the stairs. They followed Will into the studiarium. Will turned to face them. "Followers, obey me! When I speak, you will obey! Obedience knows no obstacle!" "Obedience knows no obstacle," repeated the kids. "I am your leader!" "You are our leader!" "Obey me! Obedience knows no obstacle!" cried the kids, even though Will had stopped before finishing the sentence. Professor Gelmet was in the doorway. The professor paused for a moment, catching his breath. Dr. Fugg came to a halt just behind him. The professor's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. Between him and Will stood a crowd of 50 children. 50 children he had trained to be followers, to recognize a leader, to obey. "Good afternoon, followers," he said quietly. The children turned to look at him. "Make way, followers," he said calmly. He walked into the studiarium. Will let him come a few paces into the crowd. "Followers, stop him!" cried Will. "Out of my way, followers!" cried the professor, gazing at them fiercely. The children looked around in confusion, at Will, at the professor. "Out of my way!" repeated the professor. "Hold your ground!" demanded Will. The children hesitated. "Myron Dort!" cried Will. "Hold your ground, Myron Dort!" Myron frowned with determination. He moved in front of the professor. "That's right! Hold your ground!" cried Will, and a couple of kids joined Myron. "Out of my way!" shouted the professor. And he shouted it again, but it was too late. The kids moved in and crowded around the professor on every side. He was trapped. "Thanks, Myron," whispered Will. Dr. Fugg stood in the doorway, separated now from the professor by a mass of children, her eyes wide with fear. "Followers, bring him here," said Will. The children pushed the professor forward. Now they were face to face, Will and the professor. The professor's expression changed. The ferocity went. He smiled. "Look at you, Wilbuster," he whispered. "What a leader you are, a natural leader. See how they look at you, see how they listen. They'd do anything for you. You've passed the test, Will. You've passed with flying colours." You told me that before. No, Will, murmured the professor. This is the real test. I wanted to see what you would do. Would you escape? Would you manage to get here despite everything? Would you gather your followers as a true leader would? Davina and Stanley moved closer, trying to hear what the professor was whispering. This was the true test, Will. Will looked around. The children were all waiting for his next order, unaware of what was being said. Will turned back to the professor. I don't believe you. The professor laughed softly. Do you really think I would have walked past the stair flight with you without holding each and every one of you to make sure you didn't escape? Do you really think Stanley could have taken control of that hoverpod, my hoverpod, if I hadn't programmed it so that... I could, protested Stanley. Don't listen to him, Will. I did it by myself. It wasn't programmed for me to take control. That's right, cried Davina. Don't listen to him, Will. The professor threw a glance at them. He took a step closer to Will. Don't tell me you don't love it, he said softly. Look at the power you have. Don't tell me you don't want more of it. We've barely begun. You and I, Will. You and I. Don't throw it away. What I can do for you with the helmet, Will, you can hardly begin to imagine. Ask yourself. Be honest. 3 months ago, before you came to the academy, would you have done any of this? Or would you have just thought of it and let it go? The professor stared deep into Will's eyes and continued to ask the question with his pale blue gaze. Will could feel himself drifting in the blue sea of the professor's question. Don't listen to him, Will! Will looked around. Davina's expression was desperate and imploring. Followers, put him in that chair, he cried. The children pressed around the professor, forcing him towards a chair. Sit down, Professor, said Will. The professor didn't move. Sit! The professor sat. Stanley, said Will, can you magnetise the chair? Stanley went to the chair and crouched beside it. He began to do something with the wires that ran into the floor. All the time, Professor Gelmet kept his eyes on Will. Suddenly, the professor was sucked back into the chair. Stanley stood up, smiling. What are you going to do, Will? Asked the professor, still speaking in a quiet, confident tone. Do you want to destroy all this? You were able to trap me only because of the followers that I created, and you were able to think of this plan only because of the strategies I put in your head. Think about that. It was the ambush of Groningen, wasn't it? When Frank Borgo trapped the Duke of Spitzen by convincing the Duke's own army that he had been sent as their new commander. I selected it for your knowledge input myself, only last week. Will, how would I know it was the ambush if I hadn't put the knowledge in your head myself? The professor gazed at him steadily. I'm right, aren't I? It was the ambush, Will, wasn't it? Will didn't reply. Wasn't it? Deny it, and you can do anything you like with me. Anything. But first, deny it, Will Buster. The professor watched him with a strange, greedy fire in his eyes. Ha! I'm right. I knew it was. It doesn't matter. Of course it does, cried the professor. I put that knowledge in your mind. I did, and you've used it. Can't you see what the helmet will do for you? Look at them. Look around you. See how they watch you, waiting for your next order. Don't tell me you don't love it, Will. Don't tell me you don't love the power. And this is nothing. This is hardly even a taste. Can't you see what power you'll have? Will looked down at the professor, who was locked in the seat. I want to see something else, he told him. Will made his way amongst the children who were crowded around the professor's chair and went to the small cupboard behind it. He took out the helmet that was inside. He connected it to the cable that came out of the floor. Then he came around the chair again so the professor could see him and could see what he was holding. I want to see how you'll feel, Professor, when you go under the helmet. And now, for the first time, a glint of fear showed in Professor Gelmet's eyes. No, he murmured. No, Will. Will raised the helmet and held it over the professor's head. He looked around. Everyone was watching. Davina and Stanley, the children, Dr. Fugg. In the doorway, Hendrik Targ and Barnaby Krantz had arrived. There was a welt on Targ's cheek, and Mr. Krantz himself was dishevelled, far more dishevelled than normal. His white, tufty hair was wild. His jacket was halfway off one shoulder, and there was a cut bleeding on his nose. But he and Hendrik Targ stared like the others, oblivious of everything but the scene in front of them. No, the professor was saying. His voice was rising, pleading. begging. No, Will, please, no, you don't understand. It's delicate. It's complicated. It has to be programmed specially for each person or you'll scramble their brains. Scrambled brains, said Davina. Scrambled Gelmet brains, said Stanley. Maybe I'm just being impetuous, said Davina, but I say, do it! The professor threw a terrified glance at her. Then he looked back at Will, who was still holding the helmet above his head. No, Will, I beg you, anything you want, only not this, not this. Will began to lower the helmet. Will, no, cried Mr. Krantz. This isn't right. And he tried to push forward, but the children blocked his way. The professor turned his head up, watching the helmet coming towards him. No, Will Buster, he screamed. His eyes closed, his face screwed up in terror. Ah! Will stopped. Open your eyes, Professor. Professor Gelmet opened his eyes a fraction. He saw the helmet centimetres above his head. Will pulled the helmet away and let it fall on the ground. It bounced with a hollow clatter. I don't understand, said the professor, looking at Will with fear and incomprehension in his eyes. It was a test, Professor, said Will quietly. You know what I mean, don't you? Just a test. He paused. I wanted to see what you'd do. The professor stared. Will turned around. Has anyone got a communicator? He asked loudly. Dr. Fogg coughed. I do. Mr. Krantz, said Will. Mr. Krantz nodded quickly. He stepped across to Dr. Fogg and took the communicator from her hand. It's time to call the police, I think, said Will. Mr. Krantz nodded again. I think that's a very good idea. Thanks for joining us. Tune in tomorrow for another chapter of Will Buster and the Gelmet Helmet.